The night the Duke of Ashford crossed Margaret Calloway's name off his guest list, he did it slowly. Not because he hesitated, because he wanted to be sure. His secretary stood beside him with a fresh quill. His butler waited near the door. And Lady Vivienne Ashworth, the woman who would, in 6 weeks, become his Duchess, watched from the settee with a small, satisfied smile. Edmund Ashford drew the line through the name without looking up. "She won't be missed," Vivienne said softly. Edmund said nothing. He moved on to the next name. But his secretary noticed something. He never mentioned it to anyone, not for years. The Duke had crossed every other name with a single, clean stroke. Margaret Calloway's name had 3. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday. Margaret Calloway found it on the narrow table by the door of her rented rooms in Marylebone, tucked between a grocer's bill and a letter she already knew she couldn't afford to answer. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, expensive. Her name was written on the front in a hand she didn't recognize. She almost didn't open it. She had learned over the past 3 years in London that expensive envelopes rarely contained good news for women in her position. They contained expectations, conditions, the quiet assumption that gratitude was owed, but she opened it. Inside was a single card, no crest, no formal address, just 11 words in a clean, unhurried script. "You are expected at Ashford House. Friday evening. Wear something they'll remember." No signature. Margaret read it twice. Then she set it down on the table, walked to the window, and looked out at the gray London street below. She knew the handwriting. She had seen it once before on a document her father had signed the year before he died, a document she had never spoken of to anyone, Lord Sinclair. She had met him exactly once, at her father's solicitor's office, 3 weeks after the funeral, when she had gone alone to understand the full scale of what had been left behind. The debts, the entailments, the quiet, devastating arithmetic of a noble family that had spent a century pretending it wasn't sinking. Sinclair had been there by coincidence, or so she had thought at the time. He was not what she expected. No cruelty in his face, no performance of power. He had simply looked at her across the solicitor's desk and said, very quietly, "Your father was a proud man, Miss Calloway. Pride is expensive. I hope you inherited something more useful." She had not answered him, but she had not forgotten the words. Now, standing in her small room with his note in her hand, Margaret thought about Friday evening, about Ashford House, about the particular kind of humiliation that came from walking into a room full of people who had already decided what you were. She knew about the guest list. Word traveled even to Marylebone, especially to Marylebone, where half of London's quietly reduced gentlewomen lived and listened and said nothing. She knew her name had been on it. She knew it had been removed. She had heard it from Mrs. Patten downstairs, who had heard it from her daughter, who worked in the kitchens of a house 2 doors from Ashford's. The story, as it came to Margaret, was brief and efficient. The Duke went through the list himself. His fiancée was present. Your name was crossed out. No reason given. Margaret had thanked Mrs. Patten politely, walked back upstairs, and sat very still for a long time. She was not angry. She told herself she was not angry. She was something colder than anger. Something that had no name in polite society because polite society did not allow women like her to feel it openly. On Wednesday morning, she sent a reply to Lord Sinclair's note. She used her last good sheet of writing paper. She kept her response to one sentence: "I will require a carriage." His answer came within the hour. "It will be waiting." By Thursday evening, Margaret had done 3 things. First, she had visited the small trunk at the back of her wardrobe, the one she never opened, and taken out the only dress worth taking out. Deep green silk, slightly out of fashion, perfectly preserved. Her mother's. Altered twice already. She examined it in the fading light, turned it once, and hung it on the door. Second, she had written a letter to her father's old solicitor requesting confirmation of a specific document. The response arrived by evening post, 2 lines only, but the 2 lines she needed. Third, and this was the part she did not let herself think about too carefully, She had allowed herself to remember the last time she had been inside Ashford House. Not as a guest, not through the front door. She had been 19. The late Duke, Edmund's father, had still been alive. Her own father had brought her to a private meeting, one she had not been told the subject of in advance. She had sat in the entrance hall for 2 hours while the men talked behind closed doors. Edmund Ashford had walked through that hall once. He had been perhaps 23, dressed for riding, clearly in a hurry. He had glanced at her the way one glanced at furniture and continued walking. She had not existed to him. She wondered if that had changed. She suspected it had not. It didn't matter. Friday was not about Edmund Ashford. The carriage arrived at 8:30. Black, unmarked, pulled by 2 gray horses. The driver did not speak. Margaret descended her front steps without looking back at the house, settled into the seat and folded her hands in her lap. The streets of London moved past the window, gaslight and cobblestone, the sounds of another season beginning, wealth performing itself for anyone who cared to watch. Margaret did not watch. She looked at her hands. She thought about the document in her father's files. She thought about the 11 words on that cream-colored card, where something they'll remember, she had. Outside, London glittered. Inside the carriage, Margaret Calloway sat straight-backed and silent, and she did not allow herself to feel anything she could not afford. The horses turned onto Ashford Street. The house came into view, every window blazing, carriages lined along the front, the sound of music drifting out into the cold night air. And then the carriage slowed and stopped, not at the front entrance, at the side gate. Margaret looked at the gate for a moment. Then she looked at the driver. The driver said nothing. Margaret understood. She picked up her small evening bag. She straightened her spine. And she opened the carriage door herself before the driver could move, before anyone could offer a hand, and she stepped down onto the cobblestones. She stood at the side gate of Ashford House, alone in her dead mother's green silk dress, and she looked at the door she was apparently meant to use. Then she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Lord Sinclair stood at the edge of the pavement in full evening dress, his silver-topped cane in one hand, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I thought the carriage was taking me to the front entrance," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "It was," Sinclair said. "The driver made an error." He said it in a tone that suggested the driver had made no error at all. He offered her his arm. "Shall we correct it?" he said. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the document, about her father's signature, about 3 years of expensive envelopes and quiet humiliations, and the particular arithmetic of a woman who had nothing left to lose. She took his arm. They walked around to the front of the house together, and Lord Sinclair nodded once to the footman at the top of the steps, and the doors opened. The music was louder now. The light was warm and gold. And as they crossed the threshold, Sinclair leaned slightly toward her and said, very quietly, "He's standing to the left of the fireplace. He's been watching the door for the last 20 minutes. I don't think he knows why." Margaret did not look left. She smiled very slightly at nothing in particular and walked into the room. The room did not go silent all at once. That was not how it worked in places like this. Silence in a ballroom was never sudden. It moved like a wave, from one cluster of people to the next, carried by eyes and elbows and the small, sharp intake of breath that meant look. It started near the door. A young woman in pale yellow stopped mid-sentence. Her companion turned. Then the couple beside them. Then the group near the refreshment table, who craned their necks with considerably less subtlety than they imagined. By the time Margaret and Lord Sinclair had taken 6 steps into the room, approximately 40 people had stopped talking. Margaret kept walking. She had learned at 19, sitting in the entrance hall of this very house, that the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could do was let a room know it had affected her. A room like this fed on uncertainty, on the flicker of the eye, the tightening of the jaw, the almost imperceptible hesitation in the step. She gave them nothing. She walked as her mother had taught her, shoulders back, chin level, as though the floor beneath her feet had been placed there specifically for her convenience. Beside her, Sinclair moved with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once in his life worried about a room's opinion of him. This was, Margaret reflected, one of the great advantages of being the man who held half of London's debt. She felt Edmund before she saw him. Not in any romantic sense, nothing so soft as that. It was simpler, the particular quality of a stare that does not look away when it should. She had felt it from across rooms before. She had felt it from men who wanted things from her, and men who wanted things for her, and men who simply could not reconcile what they were seeing with what they had previously decided. She did not turn left. Not yet. "Lord Sinclair." The voice came from her right, Lady Hardcastle, 70 if she was a day, magnificent in purple, with the sharp, bright eyes of a woman who had been collecting other people's secrets since before most of the room was born. Sinclair stopped, bowed. "Lady Hardcastle." He gestured toward Margaret with the quiet formality of a man presenting something valuable. "May I introduce Lady Margaret Calloway, daughter of the late Earl of Kilmore." The title landed in the air between them like a stone dropped into still water. Lady, not Miss, not the Calloway girl, not the Irish woman with the reduced circumstances and the rented rooms in Marylebone. Lady Margaret Calloway. Lady Hardcastle's eyes moved to Margaret with an expression that was not quite surprise, more the satisfaction of a woman whose instincts had just been confirmed. "Kilmore's daughter," she said. "I knew your grandmother, remarkable woman, terrifying actually." She extended her hand. "You have her eyes." "So I've been told," Margaret said. "I've always considered it a compliment." Lady Hardcastle laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one. "As you should." She held Margaret's gaze for a moment. "Welcome to Ashford House, my dear. I suspect the evening is about to become considerably more interesting." She moved away into the crowd with the serenity of someone who had just lit a match and was looking forward to watching from a safe distance. It was the title that did it. Margaret understood this. Names were one thing. Names could be dismissed, reduced, crossed off lists without ceremony. But a title spoken clearly in public by Lord Sinclair was a different matter entirely. A title had weight. A title had history. A title meant that someone somewhere had done their research. The whispers began almost immediately. She heard fragments as she and Sinclair moved through the room. Kilmore's daughter thought the line had died out Irish, yes, but the earldom goes back to, Sinclair brought her, did you see, wonder if the Duke knows. She kept her face pleasant and her eyes moving, pausing when Sinclair stopped to speak, responding when she was spoken to, performing the ancient and exhausting theater of a woman who is perfectly comfortable when she is not comfortable at all. And then she heard it. Not a whisper, a voice. Low, controlled, with the particular flatness of someone choosing their words very carefully. "Miss Calloway," she turned. Lady Vivienne Ashworth was, objectively, one of the most beautiful women in the room. Margaret had known this already. London had been saying so for 2 seasons, but knowing it and seeing it were different things. Vivienne was tall, fair, dressed in ivory and diamonds, and she moved through a crowd the way certain women learn to move, as though everyone else had arranged themselves decoratively around her. She had used the wrong title deliberately. Margaret noted this without expression. "Lady Vivienne," Margaret said. Something flickered in Vivienne's eyes, gone before it fully arrived. What a surprise! Vivienne's smile was warm, practiced, and about as genuine as a promissory note. "I don't believe you received an invitation." "I arrived with Lord Sinclair," Margaret said simply. "I assumed that was sufficient." "Lord Sinclair." Vivienne repeated the name in a tone that somehow managed to be both respectful and dismissive simultaneously, a considerable skill. "Yes, he does rather make his own rules, doesn't he?" She tilted her head slightly. "That dress is lovely. Is it new?" "No," Margaret said. "It was my mother's. A beat of silence. Vivienne's smile held. "How sentimental," she said softly. "How practical," Margaret replied, in exactly the same tone. Sinclair, who had been engaged in conversation 3 feet away and had heard every word, disguised what might have been a cough. Vivienne looked at Margaret for one more moment, the look of a woman recalculating, and then she smiled again, wider this time, and said, "I do hope you enjoy the evening." She leaned in just slightly, the way women leaned in when they wanted a sentence to land. "While it lasts." She moved away. Margaret watched her go. Then she turned very deliberately and looked to the left of the fireplace. Edmund Ashford was watching her. She had known he would be. Sinclair had told her. And even without Sinclair's warning, she would have known, she could feel it still, that particular quality of a stare that refused to release. He was taller than she remembered, broader. The years had done what years did to men like him, settled something in the jaw, put a stillness behind the eyes that could be mistaken for calm by people who didn't look closely enough. Margaret looked closely enough. He was not calm. He stood with a glass in his hand that he had not drunk from in some time, and his expression was the expression of a man who had asked himself a question and was deeply unhappy with the answer. Their eyes met. Margaret held it for 3 full seconds, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be anything else, and then she turned away. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman. She did not look back. But across the room, Edmund Ashford set down his untouched glass on the mantelpiece and said nothing to the 3 men who were talking at him, because he was no longer hearing a single word they said. He was thinking about a name on a list, a name he had crossed out. A name that was, somehow, currently standing in the center of his ballroom in green silk, being introduced as Lady Margaret Calloway, a title he had not known existed on the arm of the one man in England whose goodwill Edmund could not afford to lose. He was thinking about the way she had looked at him. 3 seconds, perfectly steady, and then nothing, as though he were furniture. Edmund Ashford had not been looked at like furniture since he was a boy. He found, to his considerable irritation, that he could not stop thinking about it. Across the room, Sinclair appeared at Margaret's shoulder. "Well," he said quietly, watching the crowd with the expression of a man reviewing a chess board, "that went rather better than expected." "Vivienne threatened me within 4 minutes of my arrival," Margaret said. "As I said," Sinclair lifted his own glass, "better than expected." Margaret looked at him sideways. "You're enjoying this." "I am enjoying," Sinclair said carefully, "watching a young woman who should have been enjoying evenings like this for the past 3 years finally standing in the room she was always supposed to be in." He paused. "Whether or not you enjoy it yourself is, of course, entirely up to you." Margaret was quiet for a moment. The music swelled. Couples moved toward the floor. Somewhere behind her, she could hear Vivienne laughing at something, the laugh of a woman performing confidence for an audience. "He looked," Margaret said finally, "not a question." "He hasn't stopped," Sinclair said. Margaret nodded once. She smoothed the silk of her mother's dress with one hand, a small, private gesture that she allowed herself because no one was watching that closely. "Good," she said quietly. And she smiled, not at Sinclair, not at the room, not at Edmund Ashford standing motionless beside his fireplace. She smiled at nothing in particular, and it was the most devastating thing anyone had seen all evening. Edmund found Sinclair at 20 minutes past 11. Or rather, and this was a distinction Edmund would think about later, Edmund found Sinclair exactly where Sinclair had positioned himself to be found. Near the east corridor, slightly removed from the main room, with a clear sightline to the door and a glass of brandy he had been holding long enough that it had reached room temperature. Waiting. Edmund did not think about this at the time. He was not, at 20 minutes past 11, thinking with particular clarity about anything. "A word," Edmund said. "Of course," Sinclair said pleasantly, as though the request were a mild surprise. They moved into the corridor. A footman appeared and then, reading something in Edmund's expression, disappeared again with admirable efficiency. Edmund waited until the door closed. Then he said, "What are you doing with her?" Sinclair considered the question with the unhurried patience of a man who had been asked questions like this many times, and had never once felt the need to rush his answer. "Attending your ball," he said, "which was, I believe, the stated purpose of this evening." "Don't." The word came out harder than Edmund intended. He adjusted, breathed. "She wasn't on the list," he said, more controlled now. "You know she wasn't on the list." "I did notice that, yes." "Then you understand my question." Sinclair looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not unkind, exactly, but precise. The look of a man measuring the distance between what someone was asking and what they actually wanted to know. He set down his brandy glass on the narrow side table beside him. Then he reached into the interior pocket of his evening coat. He produced an envelope, cream-colored, thick, sealed with no crest. He held it out to Edmund without theatrics, without preamble, with the simple directness of a man who had been waiting for the right moment for quite some time. Edmund took it. He opened it. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a promissory note. Edmund recognized the format immediately. He had grown up with them, had spent the first years of his dukedom learning, with increasing nausea, just how many of them existed with his family's name attached. This one bore his father's signature, dated 15 years ago. The sum written at the bottom was not small. The second document was a transfer of debt, formal, witnessed, legally unimpeachable. The original creditor, an Irish banking house Edmund barely recognized, transferring full ownership of the debt to a private individual. The name of that individual was Thomas Callaway, Earl of Kilmore. Edmund stared at it. The third document was a second transfer, dated 4 years after the first. Thomas Callaway, in deteriorating health, transferring the debt, along with a small number of other assets, into trust. For his daughter, for Lady Margaret Callaway. Edmund read it twice. Then he looked up. Sinclair was watching him with the expression of a man who had already had all the reactions Edmund was currently having some time ago, and had arrived at a kind of settled peace about it. "How long?" Edmund said. His voice was very quiet. "Her father acquired it 11 years ago," Sinclair said. "She's held it personally for 4 years." "Yes." Edmund looked back down at the documents. 4 years. While he had been managing the dukedom, negotiating the estate's finances, reassuring creditors, planning a strategically sensible marriage to a woman with the right connections and the right family and absolutely nothing else of interest. For 4 years, the instrument that could have reduced him to nothing had been sitting in the hands of a woman living in rented rooms in Marylebone, who had never used it, who had never, as far as he could determine, mentioned it to a single person, who had come tonight, to his ball, on Sinclair's arm in her dead mother's dress, and stood in the center of his ballroom and looked at him like he was furniture. "Why?" Edmund said. It was not entirely clear which question he was asking. Sinclair seemed to understand anyway. "I don't know," he said, with the first note of genuine honesty Edmund had heard from him all evening. "I've asked myself the same question. She had every reason to use it. 3 years ago, 2 years ago, the timing would have been advantageous. The estate was in a more precarious position then." He paused. "She didn't. She must want something." "Everyone wants something," Sinclair said. "That doesn't tell you very much." Edmund looked at him sharply. Sinclair picked up his brandy glass again, looked into it, set it back down. "I acquired the debt from her 6 months ago," he said. "She came to me. She wanted it out of her hands." He glanced at Edmund sideways. "She said, and I'm recalling this as precisely as I can, that she had no interest in holding something over a man who had never done her a deliberate kindness. She said it made her feel," he paused, as though selecting the word carefully, "small." The corridor was very quiet. Outside, through the closed doors, the music continued. Someone laughed. A woman's voice, bright and carrying Vivienne, Edmund thought without looking. He folded the documents back into the envelope. "I'd like to keep these," he said. "They're yours," Sinclair said. "They were always going to be yours. I was simply waiting for the right evening to give them to you." Edmund looked at him. "Why tonight?" Sinclair smiled, not unkindly. "Because tonight," he said, "you crossed her name off a list, in front of witnesses. And I thought," he lifted the glass, finally drank from it, "that you ought to know, before the evening was out, exactly whose name you crossed off." Edmund stood in the corridor for a long time after Sinclair returned to the ballroom. He stood with the envelope in his hand and thought about 15 years of his father's debt sitting quietly in the possession of a woman he had looked at like furniture. He thought about 3 years, 4 years of her saying nothing, doing nothing, absorbing the loss of everything her family had been without reaching for the one instrument that could have changed her position entirely. He thought about tonight, about the side gate, about the carriage driver who had made an error. He thought about her face when she walked into this room, the absolute, unassailable steadiness of it. And then, because he was, despite everything, an honest man in private if not always in public, he thought about the list. He thought about Vivienne's voice saying she won't be missed. He thought about his pen, about 3 lines instead of 1. He had told himself, drawing those lines, that it was practical, sensible. Margaret Calloway was a complication he didn't need, a connection to an old debt he preferred not to examine, a presence that made him feel things he had decided, at 31, he no longer had time to feel. He had told himself all of that. And then he had stood beside his fireplace for 20 minutes watching the door. Edmund put the envelope inside his own coat. He straightened, adjusted his cuffs, prepared his face into the expression he wore in public, the one that conveyed authority without inviting conversation. Then he walked back toward the ballroom. He did not have a plan. He was not a man who acted without plans. This bothered him considerably, and he set the feeling aside, because the alternative was to stand in the corridor until the ball ended and his guests began to wonder, and that was not an option. He pushed open the door. The room received him as it always did, a subtle reorganization of attention, the slight reorientation of bodies toward power, the particular awareness that moved through a room when its host returned to it. Edmund scanned the room. Vivienne was near the far windows, holding court with 3 women who were laughing at something with the slightly desperate energy of people trying to impress someone. Sinclair was speaking to Lord Harcastle near the entrance, and Margaret was not where she had been. Edmund looked left, right, through the groups of people, past the dancers, toward the refreshment table, toward the doors to the terrace. The terrace doors were slightly open. A thin line of cold air moved through them. Edmund crossed the room. He moved with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly where he was going, which was useful because he had no idea where he was going. He pushed open the terrace doors. She was standing at the far end of the stone terrace, her back to him, looking out over the dark garden below. The cold had put color in her neck, above the line of her dress. She had no wrap. She had not, he realized, brought one, or perhaps had not owned one worth bringing. She heard him. He knew she heard him. She went still in the specific way of someone who has recognized a footstep. She did not turn. "The Countess of Harcastle told me," she said to the garden, "that this terrace has the best view in Mayfair. I wanted to see if she was right." Edmund stopped a few feet behind her. He looked out at the same dark garden. He could see, if he was honest, very little the shapes of hedges, the faint gleam of a fountain, the distant lights of the next street. "Is she?" he said, a pause. "It's too dark to tell," Margaret said, "but I appreciate the principle." Silence. Below them, somewhere in the garden, something rustled. A fox, probably. London was full of foxes. They had learned over the generations to move through the city as though they owned it. Edmund had always privately admired this. He reached into his coat. He held out the envelope. Margaret turned. She looked at the envelope, then at him. Her expression was careful, not closed, not guarded, but careful, in the way of someone who has learned that gifts and documents from powerful men tend to arrive with conditions attached. "Open it," he said. She took it. She turned it over once, broke the seal, withdrew the documents. He watched her read. She was very still while she read. Only her eyes moved. He watched her reach the third document, the transfer into her name, and stop. Read it again. Her jaw tightened very slightly. When she looked up, something had changed in her face. Not much, but enough. "You spoke to Sinclair," she said. "He spoke to me." She looked back down at the documents for a moment. Then, with a care that struck him as oddly moving, she folded them exactly as they had been and placed them back in the envelope. She held it out to him. "These are yours," she said. "They were yours," Edmund said. He did not take the envelope. "For 4 years." "Yes." "You never used them." "No," he looked at her. "Why not?" The question came out without the control he had intended. Too direct. Too much of the corridor still in it. The 20 minutes standing alone with the envelope and the uncomfortable arithmetic of what kind of man crossed a woman's name off a list. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The cold moved between them. From inside, faintly, the music shifted, something slower now, something in a minor key. "Because it would have made me someone I didn't want to be," she said, simply, as though it were obvious. And then, before he could speak, before he could find a single word adequate to that answer, she placed the envelope on the stone balustrade between them, and she said, "You didn't cross out my name, Your Grace." She picked up her skirt slightly, enough to move. "You crossed out your own chance." She walked past him, back through the terrace doors, back into the light and the music and the warm, watchful room. Edmund stood at the balustrade. He looked at the envelope. Below him, in the dark garden, the fox moved through the hedges with the unhurried confidence of something that had learned, long ago, that this city belonged to whoever refused to be driven out of it. Edmund picked up the envelope. He put it back inside his coat, and he stood there in the cold for a long time, listening to the music change. The announcement was made at midnight. Edmund had not planned it for that evening. He had planned it for the following week. A dinner, smaller, more controlled. The kind of setting where announcements of this nature could be made with the appropriate degree of ceremony and the appropriate degree of witnesses. But Vivienne had found him at midnight, while he was still somewhere between the terrace and himself, and she had said, very quietly, with her hand on his arm and her eyes reading his face with the precision of a woman who had been watching him all evening, "Edmund now," and he had let her. That was the part he would return to later, not what he said, not the room's response, not the faces of the guests arranged before him like a painting he hadn't commissioned. He would return to the letting, the particular passivity of a man who had made a decision by failing to unmake it. They stood together near the center of the room. Vivienne had positioned them expertly, near enough to the musicians that the announcement would carry, far enough from the doors that no one could slip away before hearing it. She knew how rooms worked. She had been studying them since childhood. Edmund looked out at the assembled faces. Lord and Lady Harcastle, 3 members of Parliament, 2 earls and a viscount who owed his father favors that had transferred, with the title to Edmund. A dozen women in silk and a dozen men in black. Faces he had known for years, faces that expected things from him, that had always expected things from him, that would continue expecting things regardless of what he said or didn't say or felt in private on a cold terrace at 20 minutes past 11. He looked for Margaret. He found her near the left wall beside Sinclair. She was holding a glass she wasn't drinking from. Her face was composed. She was looking at him with the same expression she had worn all evening, steady, contained, giving nothing away. Except her hand around the glass was very still, too still. The stillness of effort. Edmund noticed this. He noticed it and he filed it away, and Vivienne's hand tightened on his arm. He began to speak. He said the things one said. He said them correctly, the right words in the right order with the right cadence, the words he had rehearsed in a different context, a different week, a different state of mind. He heard them come out of his own mouth with the faint surreal quality of listening to someone else. Honored, privileged, long admiration, family connection, confidence in the future. Vivienne beside him, radiant and still. The room approving and attentive. Edmund somewhere 3 steps behind his own face, thinking about an envelope in his coat pocket, and a woman who had held a weapon against him for 4 years and chosen, every single day, not to use it. The applause came. He received it, he smiled, or produced the thing that passed for a smile at events like this. Vivienne accepted congratulations with the grace of a woman arriving somewhere she had always been headed. Edmund shook hands. He nodded. He said the words people said back to him, and somewhere in the middle of it he looked toward the left wall. Margaret was gone. She left without speaking to anyone. This was what Sinclair told him 3 days later when Edmund finally asked. She had watched the announcement. She had set down her glass carefully on a side table without a sound, and she had walked to the entrance hall, retrieved her wrap from the footman, and gone outside. Sinclair's carriage had been waiting. She had not sent for it. It had simply been there. "You told the driver to wait," Edmund said. "I had a feeling the evening might end early," Sinclair said. Edmund looked at him. "Did she say anything?" Sinclair was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of a man deciding how much of a thing to give. "She said," he offered finally, "thank you for the evening." And then she looked back at the house for a moment. He paused. And then she said, "It was exactly what I expected." And she got into the carriage. Edmund received this information in silence. It was exactly what I expected. Not "I'm devastated," not "I'm angry," not the language of a woman who had hoped for something and been denied it. Exactly what I expected. Which meant she had known. She had walked into his ballroom knowing that he was going to make that announcement. She had dressed in her mother's silk and stood perfectly straight and looked at him across a room full of people, and she had known. And she had come anyway. Edmund thought about this for a very long time after Sinclair left. The days after the announcement had their own texture. London did what London did. Congratulations arrived, cards, letters, the occasional personal call. Vivienne managed the social machinery with expert hands, deploying herself through drawing rooms and morning calls with the efficiency of a general securing territory. Edmund managed the dukedom. He answered correspondence. He attended 2 parliamentary sessions and a committee meeting and a dinner at his club where 3 men told him he'd made an excellent choice, and he agreed with them. He slept badly. This was not new. He had slept badly for years. But there was a specific quality to the sleeplessness now, a particular shape of wakefulness at 3 in the morning, lying in the dark of the Ashford House master bedroom, looking at the ceiling and returning with the relentlessness of water finding a crack to the same sequence of images. A pen, 3 lines instead of 1, a terrace, a woman's back. You crossed out your own chance, a left wall, an empty space. It was exactly what I expected. On the 5th day after the ball, a small item appeared in one of the society columns. Edmund read it over breakfast. His secretary had placed it on the tray with the other papers, either deliberately or without awareness of its significance. Edmund suspected the former. The item was brief. It occupied perhaps 4 lines at the bottom of a page, in the section typically reserved for minor social observations, and the movements of people not quite important enough for the main columns. We note with interest the presence at the Ashford Ball last Friday of Lady Margaret Callaway, daughter of the late Thomas Callaway, Earl of Kilmore, previously believed to have retired from society. Lady Margaret appeared in excellent health and was observed in close conversation with Lord Sinclair, whose own recent business activities in the Irish markets have attracted some attention. The Kilmore earldom, dormant these 3 years, may perhaps be considered dormant no longer. Edmund read it twice. Dormant no longer. Someone had written that. Someone had chosen those words in that order and placed them in a newspaper where 20,000 people would read them over breakfast. He thought about Sinclair, about the timing. He thought about the word dormant, the implication of something sleeping, gathering itself, waiting. He set down the paper. Across the breakfast table, in the chair Vivienne had taken to occupying during morning calls, she did not yet live in the house. They were not yet married, but she had begun to occupy its spaces with the gradual confidence of a woman measuring curtains. Vivienne was reading her own correspondence. She looked up. Her eyes went to the newspaper in his hands. Something moved in her face. Fast, controlled, gone. "Anything interesting?" she asked. "No," Edmund said. He folded the paper. He drank his coffee, and he thought about Margaret Calloway in 4 lines at the bottom of a page. Dormant no longer. He did not go to Marylebone. He thought about it. He was honest enough with himself to admit that he thought about it, but he did not go. There was no reasonable pretext. There was no version of Edmund Ashford arriving at a woman's rented rooms in Marylebone, 6 days after announcing his engagement, that did not mean something he could not afford to mean. So he didn't go. He sent a letter instead. He wrote it 4 times. The first 3 versions were too much, too explanatory, too revealing, containing things he had not decided to say. The 4th version was 6 lines. Miss Calloway, I am in possession of documents which I understand were previously yours. I wish to discuss their disposition at your convenience. I suggest the reading room at Harcastle House, which Lady Harcastle has indicated is available Tuesday afternoon. I am also, he stopped at that line for a long time. He finished it. I'm also aware that the manner in which your name was handled prior to the ball was not consistent with your standing or your character. I offer no excuse for it. Ashford, he sent it before he could write a 5th version. Her reply came the following morning. 1 line, Tuesday is convenient. No salutation. No closing. No acknowledgement of the 2nd paragraph. Edmund looked at the single line for a long time. Then he put it in his coat pocket, in the same place he had been carrying the envelope. He told himself this meant nothing. He told himself Tuesday was a practical meeting about documents, about the legal disposition of a debt, about the kind of administrative matter that arose when family finances had been complicated and required resolution. He told himself all of this with the conviction of a man who knows, with complete certainty, that he is lying to himself, and who has decided to continue anyway, because the alternative is to stand very still in a silent room and admit something he is not yet ready to admit. Tuesday morning, Vivienne came to Ashford House for a fitting consultation with the housekeeper. Something about the arrangements for the engagement dinner, fabrics and flowers, and the 1,000 details of a life being constructed around him. She found him in the study, standing at the window. "You haven't eaten," she observed. "I'm not hungry." She came to stand beside him. She looked out the same window, the garden, the gray November sky, the street below with its horses and its motion. "Edmund," she said. Her voice was different from its public register, lower, more real somehow. He was always slightly startled by it, the reminder that there was an actual person inside the performance. "Are you all right?" He considered the question with more honesty than he usually applied to it. "I'm fine," he said. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "She's no one," she said then quietly. Not cruelly, simply as a statement of fact, the way one said it will rain or the roads are bad. Whatever Sinclair is doing, whatever she's doing, it doesn't change anything. We are where we are. Edmund looked at the garden. "I know," he said. Vivienne nodded once. She touched his arm briefly, her fingers light. Then she left to find the housekeeper. Edmund stood at the window. "She's no one." He thought about 4 years of silence, about a weapon never used, about 3 lines of a pen and a woman who had said it made her feel small and who had come to his ball anyway, and who had walked back through the terrace doors with her skirts in her hands and her spine completely straight. She's no one. Edmund turned from the window. He sat at his desk. He looked at the letter in his hand, her single line, "Tuesday is convenient," and he held it until the paper was warm. Then he put it away, and he opened his correspondence, and he went back to being the Duke of Ashford. He was very good at it. He had been doing it his entire life. It had never felt, until recently, quite so much like work. The article appeared on a Wednesday. Not in the society columns this time. Not the 4 polite lines at the bottom of a page where minor observations went to be noticed by people who were already looking. This was different. Half a page, 3rd column, in a publication that specialized in the particular sport of destroying reputations, with the appearance of merely reporting facts. Edmund's secretary brought it to him without comment, which meant his secretary had read it and made a decision about his own continued employment. Edmund read it. Then he read it again. The piece was structured with care. That was the first thing he noticed, not the content, but the architecture of it. It moved in a specific sequence, building its case the way a barrister built a case. Methodically, each point supporting the next, nothing overtly false, everything arranged to produce a single, inevitable conclusion. It began with the Kilmore earldom. The history of the family, Irish. Yes, old money, yes, but money that had moved badly and landed badly and eventually stopped landing at all. The late Earl's debts. The dissolution of the estate. The daughter who had come to London 3 years ago with a title that was technically valid and a purse that was technically empty, and had inserted herself, the article implied, into circles that had been kind enough not to examine her credentials too closely. Then it moved to Sinclair. The nature of their association was described with careful vagueness, the vagueness that was, in publications of this kind, more damaging than specificity. Close acquaintance, frequent consultation, a relationship whose precise character has prompted some discussion in informed circles, nothing stated, everything implied. Then it moved to the ball. The uninvited arrival, the borrowed consequence of Sinclair's arm, the dress, and here Edmund's jaw tightened because someone had described the dress, had described it as an aging piece of Irish sentiment entirely unsuited to the occasion, and the manner in which Lady Margaret had moved through the room, which the article characterized as a performance of confidence notable for its aggressive quality in a woman of uncertain standing. Aggressive. Edmund set the paper down. He picked it up again. The final paragraph was the most precise and therefore the most vicious. It noted that the Kilmore line, despite recent attempts to revive its social presence, remained without property, without income, and without the London connections necessary to sustain the kind of visibility Lady Margaret appeared to be pursuing. It noted that the Earl of Kilmore's Irish associations, specifically, a family connection to a Mr. Padraig O'Sealeg, currently involved in trade negotiations Edmund didn't recognize, were of a nature that London society might reasonably wish to examine before extending its full welcome. And then, in the last line, almost as an afterthought, one wonders, naturally, what draws a woman of Lady Margaret's particular circumstances to attend the engagement ball of the Duke of Ashford uninvited. One wonders further what she hoped to find there that was worth the considerable risk to what little remains of her reputation. Edmund put the paper face down on his desk. He sat very still. The fire in the grate ticked. Outside, rain had begun, a fine, gray, relentless London rain that made the windows look like they were thinking. He thought about the article, about its structure, about the precision of it, the specific details that required proximity, access, the particular knowledge of someone who had been in the same room. He thought about Vivienne saying on the terrace the night of the ball, "I do hope you enjoy the evening, while it lasts." He thought about her hand on his arm at breakfast. "She's no one." He sent for Vivienne at noon. She arrived at 1, which told him she had needed the hour to prepare. She came into the study in pale blue, composed, with the expression of a woman who had considered several versions of this conversation and selected the one she intended to have. Edmund did not speak immediately. He let the silence do some of the work. He had learned this from his father, the utility of silence in a room, the way it pressed on people, the particular discomfort of waiting for a man who was not yet ready to talk. Vivienne sat. She folded her hands. She waited. Edmund placed the newspaper on the desk between them. She looked at it. Something crossed her face, so fast that only a man who had been watching for it would have caught it. But Edmund had been watching. "I've seen it," she said. "Have you?" "Everyone has seen it by now." Her voice was even. "It's that sort of publication." "Vivienne," she looked up. "Did you speak to them?" he said, not a question. The flatness of a statement waiting to be confirmed or denied. A pause, 2 seconds, 3. "I spoke to someone," she said, "who I understood to be discreet." The room was very quiet. "She came to your ball uninvited," Vivienne said. Her voice had changed, still controlled, but something underneath it now, something with pressure behind it. "On Sinclair's arm, with a title no one had heard in years, positioned in the center of your room like she had every right to be there. While I was," she stopped, adjusted. "I was protecting what we have, Edmund. I was protecting our future. By destroying her reputation. By managing a situation you weren't managing." Edmund looked at her. Vivienne held his gaze. She was not afraid of him. He had always known this about her, had even admired it at certain points. She was a woman who had calculated the terms of this relationship with the same precision she applied to everything, and she had decided she could hold her ground in it. "She has nothing," Vivienne said, more quietly now. "She came to London with a hollow title and borrowed consequence, and she attached herself to a man who collects other people's leverage for entertainment. Whatever she is to you," she paused on the words deliberately, "she is not what you need, she is not what this family needs. And I will not apologize for understanding that when you apparently could not." Silence. Edmund said, "Leave the article alone, publish nothing further." Vivienne's eyes narrowed slightly. "Edmund, I am not asking." The words landed quietly. They did not need volume. Vivienne stood. She picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair. She moved to the door with the controlled grace of a woman who was not going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her hurry. At the door, she stopped. She turned. "I read the Society column," she said. "The one from last week, dormant no longer." She looked at him steadily. "Sinclair wrote that, or had it written. You know that." Edmund said nothing. "He's been planning this for some time," she said. "Whatever this is. And you're standing in the middle of it, Edmund, and you're letting yourself be managed by a man who collects debt and a woman who comes to other people's parties in dead women's dresses, and you're calling it." She stopped. Her voice was very precise. "What are you calling it?" Edmund said nothing. Vivienne looked at him for one more moment, then she left. The door closed behind her, not loudly. That was somehow worse. By Thursday morning, the article had done its work. This was the speed of it. This was what Edmund had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully understood because he had never been its target. A piece in that publication, circulated on Wednesday, reached drawing rooms by Thursday breakfast. It shaped conversations he wasn't in. It moved through morning calls and afternoon visits, gathering momentum with each telling, accumulating the small embellishments and elaborations that turned an article into a story. And a story, once it began moving through London's social machinery, was nearly impossible to stop. He heard it from Hardcastle, who called on Thursday afternoon with the uncomfortable expression of a man delivering news he had not asked to carry. "There's talk," Hardcastle said, settling into the chair across from Edmund's desk with the heaviness of his 70 years. "You know the sort, nothing specific, nothing that can be pinned, but the kind that settles." He looked at Edmund carefully. "The girl's name is being said in a certain tone now. You know the tone." Edmund knew the tone. "Lady Hardcastle is not pleased," Hardcastle added, somewhat unnecessarily. "No," Edmund said. "I imagine she isn't." Hardcastle was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. He had the look of a man assembling something. "My wife," he said carefully, "has a theory about where that article originated." Edmund waited. She hasn't shared it with me directly, Hardcastle said, but she's canceled 2 engagements this week that both happen to involve your fiancé, and my wife doesn't cancel engagements. He paused. She considers it rude. On Thursday evening, Edmund did something he had told himself he would not do. He went to Marylebone. He told himself it was about the Tuesday meeting, a preliminary conversation, a matter of logistics. He told himself this as he ordered the plain carriage, not the crested one. He told himself this as he gave the driver the address. He told himself this as he rode through the grey November streets, watching London go about its business around him with the complete indifference of a city that had seen everything. He stopped telling himself at some point between Mayfair and Marylebone, and simply sat with the truth of where he was going and why. Mrs. Patten answered the door. She was a small, round woman with extraordinarily alert eyes, and she looked at Edmund with the expression of a woman who knew exactly who he was, and had formed an opinion about him that she was not going to share unless pressed. "The Duke of Ashford," he said. "I'm here to call on Lady Margaret Calloway." Mrs. Patten's eyes moved over him with the thoroughness of a customs inspection. "She's in," she said. "Whether she's receiving is another matter." She left him on the step. Edmund stood on the narrow front step of a Marylebone lodging house in the rain and waited, which was not something he did habitually, and which he found, to his surprise, entirely appropriate. Mrs. Patten returned. "First floor," she said. "Mind the 3rd step it catches." Margaret was standing when he came in, not arranged, not the strategic positioning of a woman who had prepared for a visitor. She had clearly been at the small writing desk by the window and had stood when she heard the steps on the stair, and she was holding a letter in her hand that she had not had time to put down. The room was small, clean, precise, everything in it chosen carefully and maintained carefully, the room of a woman who had learned to treat limited resources as a discipline, a fire in the small grate, books on the shelf arranged by some system he couldn't immediately identify, a green shawl over the back of the chair. He recognized the green, the same shade as the dress. He looked at her. She looked at him. The letter in her hand, he could see now, was the newspaper article, or a copy of it. Someone had sent it to her, Sinclair, probably, or Lady Hardcastle, or Mrs. Patten from downstairs with her extraordinarily alert eyes. "You've read it," he said. "Yes." "I didn't," he stopped. "This was important to get right. It didn't come from me." Margaret looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. He had expected something else. Some version of doubt, or the withholding of judgment, or the particular careful neutrality of a person who had learned not to extend trust without evidence. Instead, "I know," simple, without hesitation. "How?" he said. Something moved in her face, not quite a smile. "Because it was too precise to be useful to you. You would have no reason to put that in a paper. What's in that article damages me, it doesn't help you." She set the letter down on the desk. "It helps someone who considers me a threat, which means it was written by someone who is threatened." Edmund looked at her for a moment. "She's going to deny it," he said. "Of course she is." "I can't prove it." "No," Margaret agreed. "You can't." Silence, the rain against the window, the fire. "The article mentioned Padre Gosileg," Edmund said. "A family connection. I don't know the name." Something changed in Margaret's expression. Not alarm, something more complex. Something that looked, from a certain angle, almost like a card being placed on a table after a long game of holding it. She moved to the desk. She opened the small drawer. She produced a document different from the one Sinclair had given him, smaller, more recent, and she held it out. Edmund crossed the room and took it. He read it. He read it again. He looked up. "Your mother's brother," he said. "Yes." "He's the Irish representative for the Northern Trade Agreement." "Yes." Edmund looked at the document. The Northern Trade Agreement, he knew it. He had been following its progress for 8 months. It was the largest commercial arrangement between England and Ireland in 30 years. Every significant financier in London had a position on it. Sinclair had a position on it. If this goes through, Edmund said slowly, and your connection to Oseleg becomes known, Margaret said. Known, he agreed, then the article becomes a very expensive mistake for whoever wrote it. She said it without satisfaction, simply. My uncle has been trying to reach me for 6 months. I didn't respond because I wasn't certain of his intentions. I became certain last week. She paused. I was going to tell Sinclair on Tuesday. Edmund looked at her. You were going to tell me on Tuesday, he said. She met his eyes. I was going to tell Sinclair. What you did with the information was going to be your decision. He held her gaze. And now? Margaret was quiet for a moment. The rain moved against the glass. In the street below, someone was calling to someone else, a brief, ordinary exchange, the city going about its life. Now someone has printed my name in a newspaper in a tone designed to ensure I am not received anywhere, she said, which means Tuesday may be too late. She looked at him with the steady, even directness that he was beginning to understand was simply how she looked at things she had decided to face. So I'm telling you now. Edmund stood in the small room with the document in his hand and the fire behind her and the rain on the glass and thought, with the clarity that occasionally arrived in moments one had not prepared for, that he had spent 31 years learning to calculate everything. Risk, return, advantage, exposure. He had crossed her name off a list because she was a variable he couldn't calculate. He understood now that this had been the most expensive mistake of his adult life. Not because of the debt, not because of the trade agreement, not because of the man in Ireland whose name had appeared in a newspaper and whose significance Vivienne had just, catastrophically, drawn the entire city's attention to. Because of the woman standing in front of him in a room the size of his dressing room, in a green shawl the color of her dead mother's dress, holding nothing back and asking for nothing, and telling him the truth. I'm going to need to make some arrangements, he said. Margaret nodded once. I'll call on Sinclair tonight. He'll be expecting you, she said, which meant she knew Sinclair well enough to know how he moved, which meant the three of them, Margaret, Sinclair, and the documents and the trade agreement and the 4 years of silence, had always been a system, had always been moving towards something. Edmund had simply been the last to understand what. Tuesday, he said, Harcastle House, we proceed as arranged. Yes, he moved toward the door, stopped. He did not turn around, because if he turned around he would look at her again, and he had reached the limit of what he could look at without saying something he could not take back. The third step, he said, on the stair. It catches, Margaret said. Yes, thank you. He went down the stairs. He minded the third step. He came out into the marrowbone rain and stood on the pavement for a moment before getting into the carriage. He did not think about her face. He thought about it the entire way home. The engagement dinner was held on a Friday. Ashford House had been dressed for it, flowers Edmund hadn't ordered, candles in arrangements he didn't recognize. The particular transformation that occurred when Vivienne's taste moved through a room and rearranged it according to her own geometry. It was beautiful. He acknowledged this honestly. She had an eye for these things, a genuine gift for the orchestration of spaces and occasions, and the dining room looked exactly as a room should look when a duke announced to 40 people that his future was settled. Edmund stood at the head of the table and thought about Tuesday. Tuesday had lasted 4 hours. Lady Harcastle's reading room, a long, book-lined space on the second floor that smelled of old paper and deliberate privacy, had held 5 people: Edmund, Margaret, Sinclair, Harcastle himself, and a solicitor Sinclair had brought whose name Edmund had already forgotten and whose competence he had not. They had laid everything on the table. The debt documents, the trade agreement correspondence, the newspaper article and its traceable origins. Sinclair had traced them, with the efficiency of a man who had been anticipating the need to do so. The family connection to Oseleg, the legal standing of the Kilmore earldom and what its revival meant in the context of the northern negotiations. It was a long table. By the end, it was covered. Edmund had sat across from Margaret for 4 hours and watched her present information with the quiet precision of a woman who had been managing complexity alone for years and had simply never had an audience for it. No performance, no positioning. She answered questions directly, acknowledged what she didn't know, and twice corrected Sinclair on points of detail with a matter-of-factness that made the solicitor look up from his papers. Sinclair had caught Edmund's eye at one of these moments. Edmund had looked away. At the end of the 4 hours, Hardcastle had leaned back in his chair and said, with the satisfaction of a man completing a puzzle he'd been handed in pieces, "Well, that's rather a different picture than the one in the paper, isn't it?" Margaret had said nothing. Edmund had said, yes. He had spoken to Vivienne on Wednesday. The conversation had been brief. Not because there was little to say, there was a great deal to say, more than either of them could say cleanly in one room without the weight of it becoming too much to manage. But Edmund had learned, from 31 years of managing Ashford affairs, that the length of a conversation was not proportional to its importance. Some of the most consequential things he had ever said had been short. He told her about the trade agreement, about Oseleg, about what the article had done, not to Margaret's reputation, though he told her that too, but to the careful architecture of a negotiation that had been 8 months in the building, and that now had Vivienne's fingerprints on the part of it that had been deliberately damaged. Vivienne had listened. She was very good at listening. She absorbed information with the stillness of someone filing it, sorting it, reassessing. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't know about the trade agreement," she said. "I know. I wouldn't have," she stopped, started again. "I was protecting us." "I know that too." She looked at him. Something in her face had shifted, not collapsed, not broken, but moved. The expression of a woman who had run a very precise calculation and arrived at an answer she had not expected. "Is this about the agreement," she said carefully, "or is this about her?" Edmund looked at her. He gave her the truth. He owed her that. "Both," he said. The word sat in the room between them. Vivienne looked at him for a long time. He could see her assembling it, taking the weeks since the ball itself, the terrace, his face during the announcement, the Tuesday meeting he had told her about, the Wednesday conversation. Assembling it the way she assembled everything, thoroughly, without sentimentality, with the clear, cold intelligence that had always been her most honest quality. "You haven't done anything," she said. "A statement, not an accusation." "No." "But you want to." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Vivienne looked at the window for a moment, then she looked back at him. "I deserve better than a man who is in this room with me and somewhere else entirely," she said. Her voice was very even. "I have always deserved that." "Yes," Edmund said, "you have." She stood. She was very composed. He watched her and thought that she was, in her way, formidable, had always been formidable, and that she would be entirely fine, would recalibrate with the efficiency of someone who had been planning for contingencies since childhood, would find exactly what she deserved and probably improve upon it. "I'll have my mother contact the solicitors," she said. "I'll have mine do the same." At the door she paused. Not the dramatic pause of the night of the ball, something quieter, more real. "Edmund," she said. He looked at her. "Don't cross her name off anything else," she said. She left. That had been Wednesday. Now it was Friday, and 40 people were seated at his dining table, and none of them knew yet. Edmund looked at the faces, familiar, expectant, arranged around silver and candlelight, and the assumption that this evening would proceed as advertised. He saw Hardcastle at the far end, who knew and whose expression was the careful neutrality of a man watching a controlled demolition. He saw 2 of Vivienne's cousins who did not know and who were going to have thoughts about it. He saw the parliamentary men who would be interested in the trade agreement angle. He did not see Margaret. She had not been invited. He had not invited her, not for this. This was not her evening to be in. He picked up his glass. 40 faces turned toward him. He had written the speech himself. No secretary, no assistants. 3 drafts, the final one 2 pages, set aside this morning in favor of something he had decided, standing in front of his dressing mirror at 7 o'clock, would be better said without paper. He began to speak. He spoke about the dukedom, about the history of the Ashford family, 4 generations, this house, the particular weight of a name that had been built by people he had never met and would be carried by people he hadn't yet imagined. He spoke about what it meant to manage that weight responsibly, about the decisions that responsibility required. The table was very quiet. He spoke about the Northern Trade Agreement. Briefly, precisely, enough for the parliamentary men to sit forward, enough for the financial men to exchange glances. He said that recent events had clarified its significance and that Ashford would be lending its formal support to the negotiation, alongside a number of other parties whose involvement he would be making public in the coming days. He saw Hardcastle's eyebrows rise slightly. He took a breath. He said, "I also owe this room a correction." The silence changed quality. "An announcement was made in this house 3 weeks ago," he said. "It was premature. The lady in question and I have reached an understanding, privately and without acrimony, and I ask that she be treated by everyone in this room with the respect she is owed. She acted with more integrity than the situation required of her, and I will not have that obscured." No one moved. "I regret," Edmund said, "that I am not in a position to offer more explanation this evening. I can tell you that the matters involved are more complex than they appeared and that the complexity was of my own making." He paused. "That is all I will say about it." He picked up his glass. "I would ask you to drink," he said, "to the Ashford estate and its future, whatever shape that future takes." A beat of silence, the particular held breath of a room absorbing something, and then Hardcastle lifted his glass, and the rest of the table followed because 40 years of social training did not allow for any other response. They drank. Edmund set down his glass. He sat. The table began slowly to breathe again, the murmur of conversation restarting, the rustle of a social occasion reassembling itself around a new shape. He could hear it moving, the story being revised in real time, the recalculations being made, the whispers that would leave this room and enter London by morning. He ate his dinner. He spoke when spoken to. He answered questions about the trade agreement with the composed efficiency of a man who had been managing public scrutiny since he was 19 and knew how to hold a line. And at the end of the table, Hardcastle caught his eye and gave him the small, almost imperceptible nod of a man who had seen a difficult thing done cleanly. Vivienne arrived at 9:15. Edmund had not expected this. He had not expected her to come. They had not discussed the dinner, had not discussed the speech, had understood between them that the dissolution of their arrangement was a private matter being handled through solicitors and would eventually become public in its own time. She was in ivory, not the same dress, but the same color, as though she had decided not to change that particular thing about herself. She came through the drawing-room door with the composure of a woman who had made a choice about how she was going to do this and was doing it. The room noticed immediately. Edmund rose. She came toward him with the directness of someone who was not going to be intercepted by anyone else first. She stopped before him, and she looked at him and she said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "I decided it was better to come." He understood. She was controlling the story, arriving on her own terms, managing the room's perception, refusing to let her absence become the thing people talked about. It was, he thought, exactly what he would have done. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. "Don't thank me, I'm doing this for myself." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm thanking you." Something moved in her face. Then she turned to the nearest cluster of guests and produced a smile of such practiced warmth that 3 people immediately relaxed, and the room exhaled, and the evening moved forward. Edmund watched her work the room for a moment. Then he stepped out through the side door. The corridor was quiet. He stood with his back against the wall and really breathed, for the first time in what felt like several weeks, and looked at the ceiling. He thought about tomorrow. He had sent a note to Sinclair that afternoon. Brief, specific, the trade agreement, the formal Ashford support, a request for a meeting on Monday to discuss the public statement. Sinclair had replied within the hour, "Monday suits. Bring the documents." He had not sent a note to Margaret. He had written one. He had written 3, which appeared to be his number, 3 attempts at things before he either found the right version or gave up. The first had been too formal, the architecture of a business communication carrying too much emotional freight. The second had been the opposite, too much, too direct, too much of the corridor at the ball still audible in it. The third he had carried in his pocket for 2 days and not sent. He took it out now. He looked at it. It said, "There are several matters I would like to discuss with you that are not related to the documents or the trade agreement or anything that requires a solicitor or a reading room. I am aware this is not a simple thing to ask. I am asking anyway." He folded it. He put it back in his pocket. From the drawing room he could hear the party continuing, the murmur of voices, the sound of someone playing the piano, Vivienne's laugh, genuine for once, in response to something someone had said. Tomorrow, he thought. He would send it tomorrow. He straightened, adjusted his cuffs, prepared his face. He walked back into the room. He sent it that night. Not tomorrow. That night at 11 o'clock, sitting at his desk with the fire burning low, he took the letter out of his coat pocket one more time. He read it. He added one line at the bottom, 4 words, "At your convenience, always." He sealed it. He gave it to the night footman with instructions for morning delivery. Then he went to bed. He slept. For the first time in 3 weeks, without interruption, without the ceiling and its particular 3 o'clock quality, without the weight of things unresolved pressing on his chest like an architectural problem he hadn't solved. He slept, and outside, London went about its nighttime business, and in a room on the first floor of a house in Marylebone, a letter was waiting to be delivered. The letter arrived at 8:30. Margaret was at the writing desk when Mrs. Patten brought it up, not because she was writing anything, but because the desk was where she went when she needed to think and didn't want to pace. She had been sitting there for 20 minutes with a cup of tea she hadn't drunk, looking at the rain on the window, thinking about nothing specific and everything at once. Mrs. Patten set the letter on the desk without comment. Margaret looked at the handwriting on the front. She did not open it immediately. She had taught herself, over 3 years of letters that arrived with conditions inside them, to give herself a moment before opening things, a breath, the small deliberate act of deciding to be ready. She was not sure she was ready. She opened it. She read it twice. The first time quickly, the way one read things when the heart was moving faster than the mind. The second time slowly, the way one read things when one needed to be certain of what one had actually read, and not what one had hoped to read. There are several matters I would like to discuss with you that are not related to the documents or the trade agreement or anything that requires a solicitor or a reading room. I am aware this is not a simple thing to ask. I am asking anyway. At your convenience, always. She set the letter down. She picked up her tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Outside, the rain continued, the same gray, relentless rain that had been falling since Wednesday, as though London had decided to hold its breath and weep quietly while waiting for something to resolve. Margaret looked at the letter. She thought about the night of the ball, the terrace, the cold, his face when she had said you crossed out your own chance, the specific quality of stillness that had come over him, not the stillness of a man receiving a blow, but the stillness of a man recognizing something he had not expected to recognize. She thought about Marylebone, his carriage in the street, his face in her small room, the way he had moved through it, taking up more space than the room was designed for, looking at everything with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a language they hadn't been taught. She thought about 4 years. She thought about the weapon she hadn't used and the word she had given Sinclair, small, and how she had meant it exactly. How the thought of using those documents against him had produced in her a feeling not of power, but of diminishment, as though the act of wielding them would have made her into something she didn't want to be. She had not held them for him. She was honest with herself about this. She had held them because releasing them, using them, would have required her to become someone capable of that kind of action, and she had enough to carry without adding that. But she had not used them, and he was here, and the letter said always. She picked up her pen. Her reply was 4 words. She had considered more, had written more twice before crossing it out. She had written a careful paragraph that said the things one said when one was being appropriately measured and not allowing hope to run ahead of evidence. She had written another version that was warmer and had frightened her slightly with its warmth, and so she had crossed that out too. 4 words. Come when you like. She sealed it. She gave it to Mrs. Patton. Then she went to the wardrobe. Not the trunk at the back, that was for occasions that required armor. She opened the main wardrobe and looked at what was there. 3 day dresses, 2 of them good, 1 of them better. A gray wool that her mother had always called the serious one. A soft blue that was perhaps too soft for what this morning felt like. She took out the gray wool. She dressed carefully. She did not look in the mirror more than once. He came at 10. She heard the carriage in the street, plain, not crested, the same one he had used in Marylebone, and then his step on the stair, and Mrs. Patton's voice below, and then the knock. She had been sitting in the chair by the fire. She stood. "Come in," she said. He looked different in daylight. This was the thing she noticed first, not what she had expected to notice, but the mind went where it went. She had seen him by candlelight, by ballroom light, by the cold blue light of a terrace at night. In the gray November morning light of her small room he looked less arranged, more real. The lines of his face were clearer, the tiredness in them, the slight hollowness around the eyes that suggested the sleeplessness he would never mention. He was not wearing the dukedom. That was the only way she could think to describe it. He was dressed for it, correctly, completely, every detail right, but he was not performing it. Not here. There was no audience. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "The 3rd step," he said finally. "You minded it," she said. "I did." Something loosened slightly in the room. He did not sit immediately. He stood for a moment near the door with his hat in his hands. She noticed he had not handed it to Mrs. Patton, had carried it himself, which was either an oversight or a choice, and he looked at the room the way he had looked at it in Marylebone, carefully, as though reading it. His eyes went to the bookshelf, to the writing desk with its single sheet of paper, to the green shawl over the back of the chair, then to her. "You replied very quickly," he said. "You wrote very clearly," she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The expression of a man who had said a thing and had it understood exactly as he meant it, which was apparently not something he experienced often enough to take for granted. He sat. She sat. The fire was low but warm. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. "I should tell you," he said, "about the dinner." "I heard," she said. He looked at her. "From Sinclair." "From Mrs. Patton, who heard it from her daughter, who works in the kitchens of a house 2 doors from mine," he finished. Margaret looked at him. "You knew that?" "I know it now," he said, which meant he had thought about it, had worked backward through the chain of information and found Mrs. Patton at the end of it and understood that this house, this street, this small and careful life in Marylebone had had its own intelligence network monitoring his for some time. He did not seem discomfited by this. He seemed, if anything, to find it appropriate. "There are things I want to say," he said. He had put his hat on the side table. He was looking at the fire. I've written several versions of them and they were all wrong." Margaret waited. "The list," he said. "I want to address the list." "You don't have to." I do, quiet, final. I want to, she waited. I crossed your name off because you made me uncomfortable, he said. That is the honest reason, not a calculated insult, not strategy. I looked at the list, I saw your name, and I felt something I had decided I wasn't going to feel, and I crossed it out. He paused. It was the action of a coward. Margaret looked at him. I've been calling it practical, he said. Sensible. I've been telling myself it was about the engagement and the appropriate management of complications. He stopped. It was cowardice. That is all it was. The fire ticked. I know, Margaret said. He looked at her sharply. I don't mean that unkindly, she said. I mean I knew. Not at the time I was, she paused, selecting the word carefully, angry. But later I understood. You were afraid of something and you removed it. It's a very human thing to do. He looked at her for a long moment. You are remarkably generous, he said. For a woman I treated badly. I'm not generous, she said. I simply see no use in carrying a version of events that makes everything harder. He was quiet. Then, 4 years. Yes. The debt you could have. I know what I could have done. Why didn't you? She had answered this on the terrace. She had given him the clean version. It would have made me someone I didn't want to be. It was true. It was also not complete. She looked at the fire. Because I had read your father's letters, she said. He went very still. They came with the documents, she said. My father kept them. Your father wrote to him twice when the debt was first extended. She paused. They were not the letters of a man who didn't care about his family. He was ashamed. He was trying to manage something that had gotten ahead of him, and he was writing to my father because my father was the only creditor who hadn't gone to the papers. She looked up. Your father said, in the second letter, he said he had a son. That the son didn't know the extent of it, that he hoped to resolve it before the son had to carry it. Edmund had not moved. He didn't resolve it, Margaret said, and the son carried it. And when I understood that you had spent years managing something you'd been handed without choosing it, she stopped. I couldn't use it. It would have been like punishing you for your father's shame, and you had enough to carry. The room was very quiet. Edmund looked at her for a long time. Something in his face was moving, not on the surface underneath, the way things moved in people when they had been holding something for years and were only now, in a small room on a November morning, allowing it to shift. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, My father would have liked you. Margaret felt something catch in her throat. She did not let it show. She was very practiced at not letting things show. He sounds, she said, like he was a better man than he gave himself credit for. Yes, Edmund said, he was. They sat for a while without speaking. This was its own thing, the silence between them, which had been charged and careful in every previous room, and was here in the morning light with the rain on the glass, simply quiet. The silence of two people who had said the difficult things and were sitting with them. Margaret refilled the tea from the small pot on the hearth. She handed him a cup. He took it without comment, which she found she liked, the absence of the performance of gratitude, the simple receiving of a thing offered. They drank their tea. Outside, the mist had thickened slightly. London moved through it, the sounds of it, horses and voices and the distant roll of wheels, with the indifference of a city that had no particular investment in what happened in first-floor rooms in Marylebone. Monday, Edmund said. The meeting with Sinclair about the trade agreement. Yes. I'd like you to be there, she looked at him. It's your agreement to support. It's your family connection that makes it viable, he said, and you've been managing this longer than any of us. He looked at her steadily. You should be in the room. Margaret considered this. Sinclair will want a formal arrangement, she said. If I'm in the room, there has to be a basis for it. A legal standing. Yes, Edmund said, I know. She looked at him, he looked at her. I have a proposal, he said, that addresses the legal standing. The fire, the rain, the tea cooling in her hands. Does it, she said. It does. He set down his cup. He reached into his coat, the same movement she had seen on the terrace the night of the ball, reaching for the envelope. But this time his hand came out empty. He had not brought documents. He had not brought anything official or sealed or witnessed. He had come with his hat in his hand. "I am aware," he said, "that I have given you very little reason to trust my judgment. I am aware that I have managed most of this badly. I am aware that you have been, throughout, considerably more composed and considerably more decent than the situation required." He paused. "I'm aware that walking into a room and making a proposal without a solicitor present and without prior arrangement and without anything except—" he stopped. "Without anything except the intention behind it is not how these things are done." "No," Margaret agreed, "it isn't. I find I don't care how these things are done." She looked at him, he looked at her. "I would like to write your name back," he said. "On any list, every list. Whatever list matters, I would like your name on it, correctly, permanently." He held her gaze. "If you would allow me." The fire shifted. A log settling, the sound of something finding its resting place. Margaret looked at Edmund Ashford, at the tiredness in his face and the steadiness in his eyes, and the hat on the table beside him and the absence of documents, the deliberate absence of anything that could be called strategy or calculation or the appropriate management of complications. She thought about the terrace, the envelope, the 3 lines instead of 1. She thought about 4 years of silence and 1 morning of rain and a cup of tea that had gone cold and been drunk anyway. She thought about a door. She put down her cup. She stood. She crossed the small room 4 steps, 5, and she opened the door to the narrow landing and she held it open and she looked at him. He looked at the open door. Then he looked at her. "There's a better room downstairs," she said. "Larger. Mrs. Patton won't interrupt us there." She paused. "If you'd like to continue the conversation." Edmund Ashford stood. He picked up his hat. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way she had looked at him across the ballroom, 3 seconds, steady, deliberate, and then he set the hat back down on the table. He wouldn't need it, not for a while. He walked to the door. He walked through it. Margaret pulled it closed behind them both, and they went downstairs together, and Mrs. Patton, who was not listening from the kitchen, heard nothing and saw nothing, and went to put the kettle on for the 2nd time that morning with the expression of a woman who had formed an opinion several weeks ago and was deeply satisfied to find it confirmed. They said the Duke of Ashford had lost his mind. He had dissolved a perfectly suitable engagement, supported an Irish trade agreement that half of Parliament thought was premature, and married a woman with rented rooms in Marylebone and an earldom nobody could spell. They said it at breakfast. They said it at their clubs. They said it in drawing rooms with the particular relish of people discussing someone else's apparent madness from a safe distance. They were still saying it 6 months later, at the first dinner the new Duchess of Ashford hosted at Ashford House, 40 guests, the same room, the same candles, a guest list that had been written by one hand and crossed through by none. Lady Harcastle arrived early. She always arrived early to things she considered important. She found the Duchess in the hallway, directing a footman with the quiet efficiency of a woman entirely at home in a house that had recently decided to become hers. The green silk was not in evidence. Something better had replaced it, deep blue, perfectly fitted, chosen rather than inherited. Though the green, Lady Harcastle would later tell anyone who asked, had been magnificent. "You look well," Lady Harcastle said. "I am well," said the Duchess, simply, as though it were obvious. Edmund appeared from the study, not the arranged entrance of a host receiving guests, just a man walking through his own house toward his wife. He stopped beside her. His hand found the small of her back without ceremony, without performance, the way hands moved when they had learned where they belonged. Lady Harcastle observed this. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman. Across London, in a publication that specialized in the destruction of reputations, someone was writing a correction. It was not gracious. Corrections of that kind never were. But it was thorough, and it was public, and it used the words Lady Margaret, Duchess of Ashford 4 times in 3 paragraphs. Vivienne read it over breakfast in her new house in Chelsea, which she had furnished herself, entirely to her own taste, without consulting anyone. She read it once. She set it down. She poured her tea. She was, by all accounts, doing extremely well. In the study at Ashford House, in a frame above the fireplace, hung a single sheet of paper. A guest list. One name crossed out 3 lines, not one, and then below it in different ink, written over and over in the same handwriting until the page had no room left. Margaret. Margaret, 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 Margaret. Nobody asked about it. Those who noticed understood. Those who didn't were not the ones it was meant for. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and share your thoughts about the story. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.